Well, returning to New Hook for a moment, I mean, there's his own numbers, the fact that he has not produced a lot, but when he's been asked to play center, he's been flanked by guys who've been struggling offensively too. And you
Hmm.
mentioned Anderson, Slavkovsky, guys like that. So there's a collection. Who are these guys? Right now, they're a collection of guys that are trying to figure themselves out, and
Yeah,
it's hard
exactly.
to be a team when you guys are searching for their own identity and trying to find their game, and it's
They're an
really
island of misfit toys.
completely. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what it is, and
yeah.
it's going to be a process. We could ask that question in 3 months from now, and we might come up with a very different answer. But if you
Hmm.
take a snapshot of where the team is right now, it's there's a lot of puzzled faces on that in that locker room right now.
Well, I think, and also in the coach's office, I mean, the wholesale changes made to the forward lines on Saturday. Our last episode was spent talking about how Marty needed to make some changes. Then he went ahead and did that. So
Yeah,
thanks for listening to the podcast, Marty. We appreciate it. But obviously, he had nothing to do with it. But he did go full on, broke up the Monahan line, brought Suzuki and Caulfield back together, did all sorts of things. Didn't look all that enthused with the result of those changes,
no,
obviously. After the game on Saturday, that's quite obvious. It didn't even last the whole game. I mean, Monahan swapped Monahan and Dvorak at some point during the game. Um, but it's just been an ongoing issue for this coaching staff to find forward combinations that work. And it's not as if they've been decimated by injury. Listen, Kirby Doc is obviously a pivotal, critical piece that they lost very early in the season. And that's a fair mitigating factor, but it's one injury, and it's not a superstar level player. Yes, in the Canadiens ecosystem, very, very important forward, but you should be able to recover from an injury to Kirby Doc with the depth of talent you had at forward.
with a mix of Monahan, Newhook, and Dvorak, you should find a solution.
You should. And
Yeah.
so I think it's on the coaching staff to make this group bigger than the sum of its parts, to make them not an island of misfit toys, to make them something, as you were mentioning earlier, um, a more cohesive group. And they haven't been able to find the right combinations. Now, are they dealing with the best possible pool of players? No, of course not. But I do think that that's a challenge facing this coaching staff. Not only do they have to develop the mental toughness that Marty was talking about, this coming from a player who was the epitome of mental toughness. Like, I mean, he mental toughed his way into the Hall of Fame. I mean, literally probably his number one attribute was his mental toughness. But that's not something you can really teach, right? That's internal. What he can do is continue working on the development of his young players, and I think that's when we ask the question, "Who are we?" I think the answer for Marty has to be, "We are a team in development. We are still in the development phase. Let's not get bogged down with the results. Let's continue making decisions that are development based and not results based." Would be an important answer to that. But I think he can help that development and the results by coming up with some configuration of this forward group that makes some sense. And they haven't seemed to been able to do that almost a quarter of the way through the season.
No, and some moves, putting Yesu Alonen on the second line against Boston was maybe a way to say, well, here's your chance, or we recognize the fact that in a limited role you've been doing a good job, so we'll go with merit. So that could be a development thing, but Marty has used on a few occasions, I won't call it necessarily a cop-out, but his argument at least was to say, well, winning is part of development. So it's never been completely dissociated between
Oh,
development.
he's not wrong.
So development and results are not necessarily two goals that are that cannot go hand in hand. But it's a question that he himself, as a coach, in terms of the priorities for his team, he must ask himself, and the management too. I mean, when they look at this, say, are they going to look at making it a shake up and say, okay, we're going to do something to try to win more games? Mm-hmm. Or are we going to refocus to the fact that we need absolutely our younger players, the under 23 or under 24 guys, to take a step forward and be better? What is it that we can do to make sure that Newhook takes a step forward, that Barron takes a step forward, that Caulfield finds his groove, and the rest might not be as important? It's a very difficult question to ask, but I think that or to answer, actually. It's easy to ask, but it's tough to answer. But this team is at a philosophical crossroads. It's to say, we wanted to win more, but we might not have the tools when we compare. Look, we were talking early in the season about standings, about the fact that, the Canadiens were deemed to finish last, were labeled as finishing last in their division, but there would be other teams, other rebuilding teams that were ready to make a real step forward. Everybody had the Buffalo Sabres on the tip of their tongue. Well, the Buffalo Sabres are still struggling. And when you look at the Canadiens, you say, okay, well, they could take a step forward and they could take another step forward next year. But it's a slow process to really climb up the ladder and climb up the standings from one year to the next. And when you take a team like the New Jersey Devils, who was able to do that within a span of 2 years, going from a bottom team to a team that's really, really competitive, to me, it seems like they're more the exception than the rule. More often than not, the young teams will fight for a long time before establishing themselves, if they ever do, because some of them will just entirely miss the boat. So there's a need for a lot of patience. But if I'm in the room with those players and I'm Martin Saint-Louis, I'm thinking, okay, patience is one thing, but I can feel around in this locker room, the impatience to win and to feel good about ourselves. And that might taint his decisions too.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that's important. It's important that, and we've talked to Marty about this, and it's you can't tell a veteran NHL player that you're sitting on the bench and this guy's going over the boards, even though he's fighting it and even though he's struggling, because we need to develop him. What does that do what does the veteran player care about that? I mean, that's definitely a balance that needs to be struck, and I think he is striking that. Listen, it's not as if, someone could argue maybe that Juraj Slafkovsky deserved to sit at some point and didn't. It definitely could have been an option used, but I think everyone in the Canadiens room sees the potential and the talent that he has, and how when he's playing at his best, he actually does help them win, whether he gets points or not. So I think that's a defensible decision to not scratch him. But it's, I think we see it late in games where the Canadiens are, verging on a win, or they're protecting a lead, or they're tied, or whatever. Like when crunch time hits, he'll sit certain guys. And there were times this season when he sat Slafkovsky for a couple of shifts in the third period in sort of critical situations. And I would argue that you shouldn't do that he needs to be in those critical situations. He needs to learn from them. And if you lose the result because of that, then so be it. Then it's a teaching opportunity, and then you have a chance to teach. Or if he sits Ylonen as an example, or Caulfield in certain sort of defensive situations, like that's where he has to kind of balance things out, and that's where it's somewhat difficult to do sometimes. These players are in a fight. They're trying to win a game. How good Juraj Slafkovsky is 2 years from now might not matter to a guy like Tanner Pearson, who could be long gone by then, or Sean Monahan, who could be long gone by then. So it's always, and when you mention management, it's clear the Canadiens management would want them to be more competitive. But if things turn out that the Canadiens are a bit more competitive than last season, but they still wind up with a pretty good draft pick. I'm not sure. I'm not sure management would consider that a total failure. I mean, there's really. I don't think management's going to go out and fix this for the Canadiens. Like, if they find an inability to win games, they're not going to go out and spend future assets on someone to bring someone in to help them win games. That's for.
Mhm.
I'm pretty convinced. I can be proven wrong if things go really off the rails. Maybe they do that. I doubt things will go that far off the rails, but because I just don't see them investing more in this team at this juncture. It's. I think when Canadiens management if they were to be given truth serum and asked, who are you? They would say we're a team that's not there yet. We're a team that needs more work. We're a team that needs development. We're a team that needs more talent. We're a team that needs a lot of things that we don't have yet. So this season, I think in their eyes, is important to building a certain culture and not allowing the culture of let's call it what it is, of tanking last season to some extent, where management quite openly was not opposed to them losing games, was not opposed to having a higher draft pick. They don't want that stench to stick to this team. Because you mentioned Buffalo, like a franchise where the stench of tanking stuck to a franchise, that's the Buffalo Sabres. That's stuck to them for a long time. But at the same time, if things just play out that way, I don't think Kent Hughes is going to be, throwing chairs in his office. It's not really something that's going to upset him that much. But it's, it's definitely.
It might upset Jeff Gorton more than Kent, though.
Yeah, perhaps.
Jeff Gorton is every loss stings.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And listen, if you look at how quickly they kind of turned things around in New York, maybe he saw it going the same way here. I don't see how you could reasonably do that, but I mean, it's there's no Artemi Panarin falling from the sky, and there's no Adam Fox falling from the sky in Montreal either. So there's a big difference between what happened in New York and what's going on here. But yeah. It's funny, like when you ask the question, who are we, you're likely to get, if you ask the players, the coaches, and management, who are the Montreal Canadiens, I feel you're likely to get three pretty different responses. According to Sean Monahan, they're a really good team who could beat any team in the league. That's as of Monday. So I just don't know how you can make that argument with a straight face just because you happen to play a couple of good games against a couple of good teams on two very separate occasions this season.
Yeah, but who are you versus who can you be it's two different questions, but it comes usually whenever I've asked that question or a variant of that question to a player or a coach, the answer is always based on how we think we can be. The how we project ourselves, how good we think we can be, how good we've been on certain occasions, and we hold on to this as who we are, rather than what's your base, what's your standard, how have you been on average? Have you been?
Yeah.
So
that's also two things that are different, because how you've been on average is clearly not, as we mentioned earlier, is not being used as the standard. They're using the best version of themselves as the standard. And right now, those best versions of themselves instances are outliers. And the standard is well below that. And so maybe they need to recalibrate a little bit, because maybe they're after an unattainable standard. And maybe that is what's leading to some of, Marty saying that playing good hockey games, he mentions the 4 games prior to the Vegas game as being like a subset or a sample of 4 good hockey games, and where they were playing good hockey, and they lost the last 2 of those games.
Yeah, they lost against Vancouver, and they lost against Calgary. Those are the 2.
If you look at the Vancouver game, I really don't know why that's included in that group. But anyhow, it's and so when I asked Marty after practice, to what extent do you think not getting the result in those last 2 games of those 4 games you're talking about led to the substandard performances against 2 of the best teams in the league, in Vegas and Boston? He said, yeah, it was a factor. And that's where the whole mental toughness thing came in, where they felt they played well, they didn't get the result, and it led to this. And it's just like so much of this Canadian season and so much of how Marty has described the team this year seems to me to be results based.
Yeah.
And Marty is the one screaming from the rooftops all the time that it can't be results based. And so they need to switch to a more process based evaluation system and stick to it. Because if they get bogged down in results, sorry to break it to you guys, but it's going to be a long year. So
you're bound to be disappointed. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
I mean, their last regulation win goes back to October 23rd. That's a long time ago.
They have two.
So you want to look at results?
Wins. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
2 regulation wins in 18 games. That's a lot of games for 2 regulation wins.